Good morning, everybody. My name is Jamie Karras, and I am the program manager here at the Holocaust Council. And we are so excited for our program today. So we do not want to keep you holding. So at that point, I would like to introduce Sue Rosenthal, who will be introducing our program. And she is a very active member for our Holocaust Council committee. So Sue, take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. Good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us at this very exciting Bagels and Books. Today, we're extremely honored, pleased, and excited to welcome the prestigious New York Times bestselling author, Kristen Harmel, who authored the book of Lost Names. This is a unique opportunity for our Holocaust Council to be able to have our very own meeting with an author with us to share with us additional information about this powerful book of historical fiction, which we know and understand is so important as we continue to read excellent and well-researched accounts of the Holocaust, and often some little known information as contained in this book. I hope all of you enjoyed reading this book as much as I did. In the interest of time, I'm now going to turn this program over to the Director of Holocaust Education, Elise Shane Brown, who has prepared some questions for Kristen. You will have the opportunity to ask questions, and if you wish to do so, please put your questions in chat. We'll attempt to get to as many as possible. Kristen, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. And thank you so much for joining us, Kristen, this morning. I'm the Director of Holocaust Education for the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. And we're so honored and thrilled to have you here today and to have everybody who is on Zoom joining us. Many of you have been in our Bagels and Books and been in programs with me before. And you know that I speak often as a historian, that I have so much value for historical fiction. So I'll just start with that, because I know sometimes with authors of historical fiction, when they get the historian together, they wonder, but I myself became interested in this. I talk about this all the time. The reason I do my job is because as a child, I loved historical fiction. So I really have tremendous value for that. So with that, I will start my first question by asking, what inspires you to write specifically about the period of the Holocaust and World War II?
That is a great question, and thank you so much for having me this morning. I apologize. I'm realizing now that I'm on Zoom, I look a little disheveled. It's I was saying to you earlier before we went on, I get up and write really early in the morning. So this is like the end of my workday and the beginning of my day with my child. So I'm just like the day's beginning.
But I completely get that.
What inspires me to write about this time period and these topics? It's interesting that you mentioned being inspired by books you read when you were a child, because it was the same with me. The book that was probably most influential in my childhood was The Diary of Anne Frank. And I'm sure, probably every third person would say the same thing. It was such an impactful book for so many people. But for me, it was the book that let me know I wanted to be an author. So I'd always loved reading. I'd always loved writing, but I never realized, just in a little kid brain, I never realized that books could make an impact in the world. I thought books were for entertainment. And if you wanted to change the world for the better, you had to, go and do something like become an attorney or become a social worker or become a politician or something like that. And reading The Diary of Anne Frank was the first time that just the light bulb went on. And I realized you can change the world through changing the way people see the world, by giving them a slightly new perspective, or by changing something or affecting something in their heart. And that really directed me on the course that would, become my life and become my career. So that book really meant a lot to me, and it stayed with me so much so that when I started writing, even way before I was writing historical fiction, I started off writing chick lit, kind of, light romantic comedies. Every one of my books has always had a character named after Anne Frank in some way. So some version of the name Anne, all the way back to, far before I knew I was going to be writing historical fiction. So that's my little tribute to her and the way she changed my life. So I think that was the first thing that drew me into it. Additionally, I was writing for People magazine for a long time. I worked for them for about 12 years. And people always assume that when they ask, what was your favorite story for People? I'm going to say, it was a celebrity interview, or it was covering the Super Bowl, or, whatever. And all those things were really cool. And I certainly had some favorite celebrity interviews, but my favorite story for People was about a man named Henry Landworth, who founded an organization here in Florida, where I live, called Give Kids the World, to help terminally ill children and their families enjoy this last dream vacation. Right. It's a long story how we get into that, but he was a fascinating man. His two best friends were Walter Cronkite and John Glenn. And he was a Holocaust survivor. So he had been in concentration camps from the age of 13 to the age of 18. And, there were so many fascinating, inspiring things about the conversations that I had with him. But the thing that stayed with me the most was that he told me that in order to survive in the concentration camps at such a formative age, he had to learn how to turn his feelings off. And when the war was over, he never knew how to turn them on again. Like, he had to learn to detach from his emotions in order to survive. But that led to this lifelong emotional detachment. And I was so struck by that, because I think, I interviewed him, I was in my early 20s. I think it had never occurred to me. I had thought so much about the tangible scope of things lost during that time period, and specifically in the Holocaust, but I had never thought about that particular psychological ramification that could steal so many things throughout the rest of your life, if that was your psychological reaction to that trauma. And that psychology was fascinating to me, and kind of formed the backbone of my first World War II novel, The Sweetness of Forgetting. And once I started, I couldn't stop. There are just so many interesting stories to tell that, even though they took place, 75 or 80 years ago, have so much relevance still today. And it feels just important to keep telling those stories.
Well, you hit on so many things, and you and I should definitely talk at another time. We could have this conversation for a long time, and so many things. And one of the things that we say all the time, and a lot of what we do at the Holocaust Council, is work with students and bring survivors to speak to them. And it's incredible that 76 years later, most of them always talk about Anne Frank still, and they talk about that inspiring them and reading that. And then when they meet a survivor firsthand and hear another story, it's truly such a connection that they have. And I think that that's what keeps us all doing those things. So I commend you for all of that. And that's wonderful.
Thanks.
So the next,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, my feeling on that is you can teach the Holocaust in school, and obviously you should teach the Holocaust in school, but there's something about personally connecting, whether it's with a survivor who you get to meet in person, or whether it's a story you connect with, whether it's Anne Frank or whether it's a piece of historical fiction. But I think it's one thing to know the facts and another thing to have your heart touched. And I think to me, that's why it feels so important to keep doing this work, because there are adults even who write to me and say, I read your book. I remember learning about the Holocaust in school, but this is the first book I've read about it. And now I feel differently because of reading. You know what I mean? So it's like, even though you just sort of assume everyone knows and everyone shares the same feelings we do, that's not always necessarily true. And it's important to teach people through touching them and through connecting with them and through that idea that it's a shared experience. You don't have to have a particular background to understand what it means to be a human being. You know what I mean?
Of course not. And that's exactly why people read these stories and still connect, because they're not, that's why we do what we do, and why it's important to remember that it's the stories that we continue to tell, because that's what's going to continue on.
Absolutely.
So having said that, with those stories, and we're both on the same page, and I stand on my soapbox sometimes and say how important it is to continue to tell stories no matter what. What do you do for your research to make sure? Because I also have spoken often on these forums with a lot of people that are on today. I talk about why it is so important to have the facts right, or to know that it could be plausible, but even when we're writing fiction. So what is it that you do to make sure that your stories, and I've read several of your books, not just the Book of Lost Names. So what is it that you do to make sure that they are as historically accurate as possible?
Well, that's a great question. And it's so important. And I always say that even if you get one tiny detail wrong, it can ruin the believability of the entire story. And it could be something as simple as, getting the color of blackout curtains wrong, or, you name a train transport route that didn't actually exist, and it might only ruin it for a couple of people, but if you miss those little details, it can ruin your credibility, sort of. So I think I approach it from my background as a journalist. And I think back to those days in journalism school where if you got one fact wrong in a story, you automatically got 50% off your paper, which was an F, right? So like in my mind, if you miss one little thing, that's an F. And I don't want an F on these books. I really begin at the beginning when I have an idea, and I do as much reading as I can. I feel like reading nonfiction written about whatever it is I'm writing about kind of forms the backbone. And then I try to listen, depending on what I'm writing about. I try to listen to any, recorded survivor testimony, people who had been in that time period. I try to read memoirs from people from that time period. And I just dig into the research as much as I can. If it's possible, I try to interview people myself firsthand. But as as the years go by, the opportunities for those kind of connections are getting fewer and fewer. Not just because we're losing the people, but because even a lot of the people who are still alive have lost some of their memories or some of the specific memories of that time period. So it's getting more and more difficult to form those personal connections as the years go by, which I think makes it even more important to preserve these stories while we can. But for the Book of Lost Names, for example, one of the things I needed to wrap my head around was forgery. I mean, that was something I really had to get the details right on, right? I mean, and I did a ton of reading about forgery, but there were things I didn't, I felt like I understood intellectually, but I felt like, like I'm not wrapping my head around it enough to make it sing on the page, if that makes sense. And so one of the things I did for this book was to try to get my hands on some real life documents from that time period, so I understood what people would have been forging. So I want to show you one of them. This was a real life Nazi issued travel document. So you can see the Nazi heraldic eagle stamp. This was issued the 2nd of December in 1940. And this is what you would have needed to move around the country. So if you were a Jew fleeing Paris, or if you were an Allied airman who'd been shot down over northern France and you were trying to get to the Pyrenees to escape, you couldn't go anywhere without one of these. So this was a big thing that forgers forged. And to me, having that physical document helped helped all the facts that I had read about come together in my head, and I think made me a little bit better able to write about it. So that's another example of the kind of thing I try to do for my research. Having as much firsthand information, and sometimes that information comes in the form of physical items that I need to sort of put my hand on to understand, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I would imagine, and I don't know how, especially in this last year and right before everybody got on, you did say you were researching and writing a whole new book over this.
Yeah.
Does it involve travel? Does it involve going firsthand? And yes.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It almost always does. I used to live in France, which is why I tend to write about France so frequently. I feel like having spent not so much time, but having spent time living there, I feel and having returned there so many times for research, I feel very comfortable writing about that country. So for my next novel, which will come out in July, it comes out July 6th. It's called The Forest of Vanishing Stars. This is it. This one was set in Eastern Poland, which I had the idea and sold the book before the pandemic started. And it had been my intention to travel to Eastern Europe to do research. But then the pandemic happened, and obviously that wasn't going to happen. And so the research on that one was a little bit different because it takes place primarily in a forest, a vast forest that during the war was in Eastern Poland, but now is in Belarus. And a lot of the things I had to find out were things I couldn't find online. I mean, and they were very specific things. What kind of trees would have been in this area of the forest? Or what kind of mushrooms would refugees have eaten? Or how did they build shelters in the winter? Things like that. And I was so fortunate to find, the forest is called the Nalibaki. I found a Nalibaki forest guide who also has a PhD and has written a book in Belarusian about the flora, fauna, and human interactions in the Nalibaki forest. So his book was very helpful, but then he and I spent hours and hours and hours and hours conversing together, nailing down all these little tiny details. So I was so fortunate to find him. I mean, it was, I honestly don't think I could have written the book with the authenticity I did without him. Um, so that was the way I made up for the lack of travel in that. And also for that one, I was really lucky. I don't know if you know the story of the Bielski brothers.
Of course, yes, and we actually have some members of them that live in our community, so we're very fortunate here.
Awesome. Well,
yeah,
the only surviving Bielski brother, the youngest of the brothers, Aaron, lives
and
here
he lives in Florida.
He lives in Florida, where I live. Exactly. So I was able to interview him for this book, which was really cool. That kind of added another. I mean, that wasn't a travel related thing, but it was
right. But I would imagine that would be very interesting. And we hopefully, afterwards, I will read the book and we will have you back, and we, maybe we'll have one of the grandchildren that we know in our community join us, and we could do something together.
I would love that. That would
look forward to. So we have a few questions coming in that actually are very interesting. I want to be able to ask you. So someone said that they were very impressed with the code that you devised for hiding the children's names. Where did that come from? Was that at all based in truth, or was that something you developed on your own?
So it's a great question. So for any of you who haven't read the book, the code in the center of the book is a code. So Ava, the main character, works with another forger named Remy, and together they're concerned about preserving the identities of these children whose names they're changing. And so they put them in code in a book that they call the Book of Lost Names, hence the title of the novel. So the Book of Lost Names in the book is a 1732 religious text, just a completely nondescript book that you would be very likely to find in an old rural church library, which is where they're doing their work. So the first part of the answer to that question is the book itself was based on this, which is a real 1732 religious book in French. Like I said, published in 1732. And I'm trying to find, how interesting is this? The person who designed the cover of the Book of Lost Names never saw this, but look, it looks so similar. The gilding has worn off, but look at the spine though.
Wow.
Look, I mean, I feel like she nailed it without ever having seen this. So this is the real, in my mind, Book of Lost Names, but the code within the novel was not a real thing. That part was fiction. Right. So what I did was I used the real pages of this book. I didn't write in it because I couldn't bring myself to deface a 1732 religious text. That just felt wrong on a couple of levels. But I did use the pages. So if I said on page 163, there was a star over the P in par and a dot over the E in Celui, like it was, from that page of the book, right? So that was very accurate. But the code, I went down the research rabbit hole trying to figure out, I know there needs to be a code in this book. It needs to be something they can put in this Book of Lost Names. What is the code going to be? So I went so far down the rabbit hole. I was reading all about, things they developed at Bletchley Park and, things the military was doing. But like none of those things were things that two young amateurs would have come up with in a church library in rural France, right? So I was thinking, and then one day the light bulb went on and I thought of the Fibonacci sequence, which was a math sequence I had been obsessed with when I was in about third grade. So when I was a kid, I had this, like how you have weird ambitions or dreams when you're a child. So, I went through, as everyone does, that or a lot of people do, that little period of time where I was convinced that I was going to be a pop star, for example, right? But then, the lack of singing ability held me back in that area. So sad. But one of my other little, goals was I was going to be the kid who solved the world's unsolvable math problems. And so I probably spent 6 months lying in bed at night doing the Fibonacci sequence in my head as mental gymnastics, preparing for my eventual world domination of childhood math problems. It was insane. I don't know what I was thinking. But the Fibonacci sequence was a relatively simple math sequence where you add the two previous numbers to get the next number. So 0 plus 1 equals 1. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 2 equals 3. 2 plus 3 equals 5. 3 plus 5 equals 8, and so on. So the two previous numbers to get the next number. And it made sense to me that if you used stars and dots on pages according to that numerical sequence, and you started a new page for each child, that would be something that you could only decode if you knew exactly what it was based upon, which seemed like something that would not be outlandish for two young amateur people to come up with, that would still be relatively foolproof. If it wasn't, I'm sure if you gave it to a real code breaker at Bletchley Park, for example, they would have cracked it in 30 seconds. But to the casual observer or someone not trained in this, it would have been, at least for a while, an impenetrable code, which means it worked. But that's how I came up with it, by being a third grade math dork.
I was gonna say, and the reason I do what I was doing, because my dream as a kid was to be a Nazi hunter, actually,
That would be awesome.
until my father was like, you're going to grow up, and when you're an adult, you know that that's really not going to be so much of a job. So that was the evolution. So I do actually understand exactly what you're saying, and it does make sense, because as if a third grader can do that, then you figure it wouldn't be obvious to the awesome eye. So I get that.
Exactly.
So the next, shifting a little bit, is the next question that I had, was that so much of the book is centered around Eva and her relationship with her mother and her relationship with her father. Even though her father exits very early on, there's still so much in there. Was that a thought for you? Did you consciously plan that with her parents? What was the thought of why you did that and focused that way?
So her father, for the story to unfold, her father had to be gone at the beginning. I just saw that from the moment I started outlining the book. And that had to be something that drove her, the guilt of that, the desire to get him back. That kind of gives her a reason once she gets to Orignon, to agree to work with the priest, because she thinks he's going to be able to help her getting her father out. And it also creates a real tension between her and her mother. So one of the questions I get often about the book is, like, what's with the relationship with her mom? Like, her mom seems so mean. And they have there's a lot of conflict in their relationship. And here's the thing: I don't think her mother's mean. I don't think her mother's coming from a bad place. I think that her mother, when you think about it, was, got married very young, left Poland with her husband, came to France to start a new life, and was always a fish out of water there, was always just living, her husband was her rock. She never fully adapted to the language, never really adapted to the culture. Her world is very small, right? And so when her husband is taken away and she and her daughter have to leave the only life she's ever known, the entire foundation of her world is shaken. Ava has a much bigger life. Ava is going to university. Ava is working at this library. Ava has bigger dreams for her future. Ava has been exposed to the world in a way that her mother hasn't. And I think that sets them up to have two completely different reactions to everything that comes. So Ava, as the story progresses, Ava makes the decision to begin working with the resistance to help people. All her mother sees, though, is that every step Ava takes toward that is a step further away from her and a step further into danger. And she's a mother. She wants to protect her child. And so I think that all of that conflict between them, all of her mother's seeming inflexibility, is really rooted in love and fear. And I think that I think, and not to give any spoilers if anybody hasn't finished the book, but I think you see toward the very end that it was love driving the mother all along, and that she did respect what Ava was doing. She just didn't want to let her go, and if she could just hold on to her tighter and tighter, maybe she could save her too.
So shifting to that, and I completely got that from reading the book, for sure. Shifting to that, did that affect how you wrote Ava's relationship with her son, with Ben, and how you wrote those flashbacks? Did you speak to survivors about second generations or anything like that? Because that is a lot of work that we do. And also, as I'm going forward, thinking of how we're going to do things in the future with second and third generations, was that a conversation you had, or did you think about that as you wrote that relationship as well?
I don't think Ava's relationship with her son, at least in my mind, was shaped by her relationship with her mother. I mean, I'm sure it was a little bit. I think all of our relationships are shaped by our relationship with our mother, right? I mean,
Right.
it shapes who we are and how we go forward. But I think to me, Ava's lack of transparency with her son was more about her own feelings and her own guilt. So I think Ava felt like a lot of things that happened at the end of the war were her fault. That people died because of her. That she failed to save them. That that ultimately she didn't protect what mattered most. And I think that as as tends to be the case with some survivors, and I guess let me pause that by saying, yes, I've talked to survivors over the years, and I think there are as many psychological reactions to the trauma of what went on in that time period as there are people in the world. I think we all react differently to different things, and two people could go through an almost identical experience and carry it through the rest of their lives in a completely different way, because it just has to do with who you are on the inside, right? So to me, who Ava was on the inside was somebody who thought that if she could just put it all away in a box and start a different life, she could leave all of that guilt and pain behind. And of course, as I know, and as you know, and as all of you probably know, you can't do that. Like, that only lasts for so long, right? It's like a fake it till you make it technique, but you never really make it, like, because the past is never really gone, and it's always going to be there. And the pain of what happened in the past is always going to be there if you don't confront it and if you don't deal with it. And so to me, Ava was somebody who thought she could deal with it by just becoming someone new. But because of that, it was always there, always eating at her and always affecting every relationship she had going forward. And when a relationship, such as a relationship with your child, starts with basically a fundamental, not lie, but just misconception about who you are, there are always going to be walls up in that relationship. And so I think that part of Ava's transformation as a person toward the end of the novel has to begin with her being honest with her son.
Right.
Does that make sense? And
Yes.
does that match up to your
Nope,
experience?
absolutely matches up to exactly
Yeah.
what I was thinking and where it goes and why things evolve over time. And sometimes, as in this case, later in life, you suddenly feel the need to share. So I do understand that. Going back, we have another question coming in that's going back to the idea of the research and so on. So someone's asking if you had any communication with Adolfo Kaminsky, who is a forger in the French underground and lost his family before or while you were writing the book.
Yeah, he has a fascinating story. I did not connect with him directly, but I did read the memoir he wrote with his daughter, which was very educational. And in fact, he was one of the people who kind of formed the basis for the characters of Ava and Remy. So Ava and Remy are fictional characters, but the way they get into forgery is very similar to the way that Adolfo Kaminsky and another forger of the same time period named Oscar Rosowski. It's similar to the way the two of them got into forgery. They were both, Kaminsky and Rosowski were both young Jewish men who had to forge documents for themselves and for their families in order to get out of the areas of France they were in, and in order to protect themselves. And it was through those forgeries that they discovered they had a talent for it, and found their way into the resistance movement because of that. So yeah, he and some actually, specifically, one of the techniques in the book, Remy mentions using lactic acid to dissolve Waterman's blue ink. And that was something that Kaminsky discovered because he used to work for a dairy conglomerate, and they used to test whether cream had been watered down by testing how long it took Waterman's blue ink to dissolve in that cream. And he realized, therefore, that lactic acid could be used to delete Waterman's blue ink. So that did come from Kaminsky's memoir.
Great. There's also, that's excellent to be able to use that and to shift, because there was so much written about the resistance, and also so much we don't know about what people did in the resistance, because for many years, many people didn't speak about that. So it's excellent to be able to get those stories out and bring them to light. The next question is, your book was so well placed that I could not put it down. As an author, can you speak a little bit about how you achieved that so flawlessly that you kept the momentum going in the right way?
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I'm a big believer in outlining. So I outline very thoroughly. And I think I've been doing this long enough that I know in the outline if the pacing is wrong. And sometimes it is. Sometimes the first outline, you sit back and look at it after you've written it, and it's like, oh, wow, I really lingered in this same scene with nothing really happening for 2 chapters, and that's not really going to work. So I think I fix a lot of the pacing problems at the outline level. And then this is something I've learned like later in writing books, because it used to be that I would write much longer first drafts and I would have to cut a lot of it out. Now it's such a simple revelation, but I've realized if I'm getting bored while I'm writing a scene, someone's probably going to get bored while reading a scene. So I used to just slog through like, oh well, I've said I have to write this in my outline, and so I'm going to write it. But if I'm bored while I'm writing it, there's a problem, and so I either need to tighten the scene, or I need to cut the scene, or I need to find another way to deliver the same information. So it's also paying attention to like my interest level in my own story as a writer as I'm going, and if that's not there, I need to kind of find another way. So I really think it just boils down to that outline, and then being very conscious of what I'm writing along the way to kind of keep making sure things are happening, things are progressing, and that I don't waste, 3 pages describing the color blue of her dress or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
So that you stick with the topic. I get that when we veer off a little. I understand. So
and
that
I think it's good to have a lot of dialogue and a lot of movement in books also, which I think kind of comes from a little bit of a screenwriting sensibility too. Like you always kind of have to have things happening. So it's finding that balance between things happening and also providing like the historical backbone of information, if that makes sense.
Right. And not putting too much in it and then keeping the
Yeah.
movement going.
Yeah,
Excellent.
exactly.
So the next question, somebody wrote, I personally liked the happy ending. What made you choose to do that? Since some readers might have felt like that would be somewhat of a miracle, or, how did you balance that, and why did you make the decision to have that happy ending?
Well, okay, so let me, it is, I agree, there is certainly a happy reunion, but then again, is it a happy ending? Because they missed their entire lives together. And they both missed, or they both made all these decisions in their lives, and lived half lives in a way that they wouldn't have if they had found each other sooner. I will tell you that if you have not read a lot of my books, not all of my books end that way. I'm not somebody who's like, let me just put everyone together at the end. I mean, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But the title of the book was The Book of Lost Names. It was about this book that's at the center. And another element of the book is that there is this heroic librarian based on real librarians in Germany who are working to reunite, these lost books with their rightful owners. And so I loved the idea that it was this book at the center of it that was important to them during the war that ended up resurfacing and being the thing that reconnected them in the end. It was always the ending to me. It was always, before I even really knew who these characters were going to be, as soon as I knew that the search for the book was going to wrap around the historical story, I knew that the book had to do that for them at the end. So that was kind of how I made the decision. But I still think even in the happiness, there was sadness. I mean, they're at the end of they're toward the end of their lives, and yeah, it's sad. I mean, I think even when you do ultimately somehow put pieces back together from that time period, it's still staggering how much was lost along the way.
Yeah, so that's actually an excellent way of putting it, is that it was a happy ending in some senses, but there was also all that sadness of all that lost time and all the rest that was lost from it.
So
I know you're rushed with time, so I just have 2 more questions, but one that we can get to first is somebody said they love the book, but they have not read your other books. Are they all about the Holocaust, World War II, the same genre?
No, and that's a good question, and I'm just saying this like making fun of myself, not joking about the question. But my first novel, like I said, I started off writing chick lit. So my first novel, called How to Sleep with a Movie Star, not set during the Holocaust. And also not a real how-to guide, for the record. It's a story about a woman who gets involved in this, in a situation where the world thinks she's having an affair with a movie star, and really she's not, and her life spins out of control. So if you're interested in like the current Kristen Harmel, which is like, I kind of feel like those earlier books shaped me as a writer, but then I really began what I think of as my current career with The Sweetness of Forgetting, which was 2012. So if you're interested in reading this type of book, I would start with my books in 2012. And all of them have involved World War II, except for The Life Intended, which was my 2014 book, which is set more in the modern day and does not include a Holocaust element. But the others do all involve World War II.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And for our last question, and again, we thank you so much for coming on, and we hope
my
to welcome you
pleasure.
back to our community in the future. I'm personally very excited
Oh,
for
I
the
would
next
love
book and to
that.
hear about the connection.
Well,
But,
I would actually love to connect with you about getting in touch with maybe with some of the Bielski grandchildren that you mentioned.
Sure, sure. Well, you have
that'd be
my
fantastic.
contact now, and always
Perfect.
happy to help in anything. I
Perfect.
do this as a sidebar. I help writers make sure
That's
there's
awesome.
historical accuracy. So you can always
Great.
call me. Not a problem, and I commend you for that. But the last kind of question we have coming in is, you do a phenomenal job of developing the characters. So you really begin to feel a relationship with them. What makes you decide to develop like a character as the enemy or a character as the protagonist? Like you switch Joseph throughout the novel. So like examples like that. So how did that come about?
So to me, that's probably the most natural part of the writing process. How do I explain it? So my process is basically, I have a basic idea, right? Like a short idea that I can sum up in a paragraph. And then I start doing the research. And as I'm doing the research, the characters are kind of developing in the back of my mind. So I don't usually put pen to paper to jot down anything about the characters yet, because I just want them to sort of develop naturally without me committing to anything. But as I'm doing the research, I'm thinking like, oh, like, so this character could do this and this character could do that. And once I begin to sort of have an idea of like the main plot beats of the novel, like not the psychology of them, but like, okay, like this needs to happen and then this needs to happen and then this is where we need to be at the end. Then I start really narrowing down who these characters are going to be and what their motivations are and what their backgrounds are. So I used to teach a writing class years ago, back when I was writing chick lit, where I recommended doing character outlines for each character, the major characters and the minor ones. And for me, it was all about knowing who these characters were before they set foot on the page. So like before you meet them on page one, like what have their previous 20 years been like? What are their, how do they react when they're angry? How do they react when they're hurt? What psychological damage have their parents inflicted upon them? What good things have their parents given them? Like how have they faced the world? How has the world faced them? Like, all of those things. So I used to write very long character worksheets explaining all of that, but now I think I just kind of do that in my head. But I need to understand the psychology of each of the main characters more than I understand. Like, I don't, it's almost secondhand. It's like almost a second tier or almost of second tier importance to know, like, oh, are her eyes blue? Is her hair brown? Like that stuff doesn't matter. I mean, it does. And I need to be able to see the characters, but like, I need to know what makes them tick. And once I know what makes them tick, I can set them in motion on the page. And it's like just wind up toys and they just do their own thing. Like you just wind them up and they go. Right. And so, like I said, I outline in a ton of detail, but you really get to know the characters as you begin writing. And there's no amount of outlining you can do that will let you know the characters until you begin writing the story. And so I always say that I think my outlines differ. They're maybe 80 to 90% similar to the final book. And the changes happen because the characters take the story somewhere different than I expected. And so in the Book of Lost Names, I at the beginning didn't know that Joseph was going to turn out the way he did. I had Eric being the person who betrayed them. But as I began writing Joseph, I was like, nope, like it's got to be Joseph. Like just the Joseph I saw at the beginning, I'm like, this is a Joseph who's out for himself. This is a Joseph who cares about other people, but cares about himself more in a really unhealthy way. You know what I mean? And like Joseph is the kind of person who would do anything to save his own skin. And so that was a matter of getting to know that character and realizing then in my head that the story could really only go one way, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the long answer to that question. I hope that answered it.
No, that makes complete sense. And thank you for sharing that. And I completely understand how that could develop and change over time, because people develop and change over time as well. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, people develop and change over time, but I feel like we stay very much the same at our core. You know what I mean? And so I think it's about figuring out from the beginning what is at people's core. Like, are you ultimately a good person? You know, like I wrote a book called The Winemaker's Wife that came out. It was my 2019 book. And one of the characters in that book, Inez, was somebody who a lot of readers don't like at the beginning. And she was a difficult character to write because she makes a lot of really bad decisions and she makes a lot of selfish decisions. But to me, the what redeemed Inez, which she was always good at her core, she just didn't know how to be good until she grew up a little bit. Hang on one second, Noah. Sorry. She didn't know how to. She had to tap into that core and figure out that path. But like, I feel like some people have that within them, and some people don't. And you just kind of have to know with your characters, ultimately, who is this person deep down inside.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I didn't like her so much at the beginning either. I thought she was a little whiny, so I get it.
She was, yeah.
So I completely understand. But we can't thank you enough for joining us today. And we look forward to connecting with you again and with welcoming you to our community, maybe hopefully in person one day. We would love to be able to see you. So thank you so much.
Too. And thank you so much for having me. Thanks for choosing the book. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Everyone else, we can stay on. We still have some more time, and here to have our kind of regular what we would do since we shift this open conversation and discussion. I'm happy to answer any more questions or bring that up. One question I had, and not to put everybody on the spot, but I know I see that we do have some of our wonderful survivors that are from France on here. But the fact that I'm always very interested in the French story, and I don't want to put either of you on the spot, but if there's anything that if you read the book or you would like to share, I welcome, I see two, but either of you to join us. Can we unmute, or is there a way to unmute if anyone wants to speak, or you can unmute yourselves?
Okay. I wanted to make a comment. When I first started reading the book, it really was my story, except I was only 6 years old. But I was arrested by the French policeman, and that's why I wanted to make a comment, but I'm not such a wise with the, to send you a message. I wanted her to realize how much, and I'm really, for a young lady, the way she is, to do so much research. And it's so, I know it's a fiction, but it can be so real, because I went through that, and I could definitely, it was like I was reliving my life.
Well, I mean, that not in a good way, I hope,
No,
but also to recognize that she did do, and I recognized at the beginning, she did do a tremendous amount of research, and I was extremely impressed with that.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing that. And is there anything else that anyone else would like to share? Stella, do you know how, can you unmute, Stella?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. I haven't read the book, but Jen was telling me about it, so I plan to do that. I've been writing notes about it. I knew a forger who was a daughter of people who really did a great deal of help to my family. And unfortunately, she was killed on the street. They just shot her. And they caught her with a bunch of papers that, were forged, and that was the end. And the parents were very helpful, and they instilled that in their daughter. So they had two daughters. One would lived in the suburbs and sheltered me for a whole summer, and this one was really very active person, either forging or carrying forged papers, and she met a very early end.
Right. Yeah, no, it's really incredible what forgers did throughout all of Europe, but we know I've heard many stories in France. And when I was reading the book, I did actually think of you, Stella, for two reasons. One, the forger, but I also thought at that kind of happy ending at the end that she spoke about that was happy and not happy, was I thought about how we've tried in the past to find the soldier that you have in the picture. And maybe one day we will be able to find that. So as much as everybody said they was happy, unhappy, I did think about you while I was reading the end of the book as well. So I do think you would enjoy reading it and thinking about that. So thank you. Thank you both, Stella and Helene, for sharing with us. It means a lot when we hear firsthand about this, when we read these books. Another question that I had about the book, that when we didn't know that we were going to be fortunate enough to have Kristen joining us, one of the things that I was going to bring up was the power of her written word. And she even writes about that in her author's note. If anybody read it, she wrote, so I'm going to read to you. You don't need money or weapons or a big flat platform to change the world. Sometimes something as simple as a pen and a bit of imagination can alter the course of history. So did anybody else have any thoughts about that while they were reading the book, or read the author's note and come back to that, thinking about how much in this book, even the title, The Book of Lost Names, had so much to do with pen and paper and changing things? Is there anything, did anybody else think of that or pick up on that? You know, it's hard online.
I didn't, it's Terry, I'm in my
Hi,
bathroom.
Terry.
I just thought, and this is not really Holocaust related, did anyone read the end of her book? What's it called? The prologue at the end? And she writes this love letter sort of to independent bookstores, writers, readers. And I thought that was so touching. And I sent it to all my friends who write and buy books, and like how important it is as that community exists, because we're in such a virtual world and electronic world. And yet, and I'm a believer in reading a book and seeing the cover, that she really felt buoyed by all of these independent bookstores and writers and her writing group, right? Like all of that camaraderie that, you know, you aren't as much as you're a loner when you're a writer. She has this amazing community. And I was inspired by that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And even when she spoke about just now, when she spoke to us about the detail and going into the cover of the book, it's like something that when you read it electronically, you lose a piece to that clearly meant a lot to her as a writer. As she wrote about what was on the cover and how it was designed, it meant a great deal to her as an author. So that's absolutely very true. So are there any other thoughts or comments on the book? I did want to share if there's anybody else that had anything they wanted to ask or comment on. But I did want to share that actually, I just watched, it was Sue's recommendation and I had seen it. I did watch a very interesting short film that won the Oscar that talks about the effects of French resistance called Colette. I can put it in the chat. It was out all over, and like I said, it won the Oscar, but it was very interesting. And it was about somebody that her and her brother were in the resistance, and her years, she's in her 90s now, and years later in the French Resistance going back. And so I do highly recommend, if you liked this and you want to learn more about this story, that was a really great short film, and it was easy to find online, and it's less than 30 minutes. So I highly recommend reading it. And are there any other thoughts or comments or questions that anybody had about the book club or about having the author? I have a question. Did everybody enjoy the opportunity to hear from the author? Is this something that you would be interested in us doing again in the future?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Totally,
Definitely, sure.
totally. That's what I've seen so many authors through the JCC of Central New Jersey. They have authors all the time. And that is the most exciting way to learn about a book, is to learn about it through the person who wrote it. I can't imagine, if you can do it that way, that's the way to go.
Great. So that's good to know. I'm glad that this was able to work out and something we would be looking to do in the future. And what about, we like to balance in terms of memoirs and or fiction as opposed to nonfiction. Did everybody enjoy the opportunity to read and look at this through the piece of historical fiction? Yes. Okay.
Liz, can I say something?
Of course.
So I was just messaging Sue. I'm actually somehow got onto your, I don't know, all these Zoom things. I relocated from the West Coast to now I'm in Florida. And this is fantastic. I haven't heard of this author before. Page Turner. I'm a 2G, so it's particularly pertinent to me. And I got involved with a 2G group here in Tampa, and we had Helen Epstein in February. I mean, this is what we're doing, is like once a month, there's these book club and movies, which I'm trying to write my dad's memoirs right now. And I can't, because I'm involved with all of these books that, you know, my stack is growing. So if I could just speak for myself, I think that's a fantastic idea. And again, I don't know what you normally do or don't do, if this is an offshoot from COVID or Holocaust outreach, or again, how you operate from the Federation, but it's fantastic.
Can you share your resources with us?
Absolutely, because I know there's some people, I mean, I've got contacts of my own, but contacts through them. And there are people here who snowbird from Detroit and come down to Florida. And so, you know, we've had big Zoom meetings where, you know, authors from, you know, Detroit lecturing us as well. So absolutely.
Thank you. We will certainly be in touch. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad that you were able to connect with us and join us today. And this has been working well. I mean, as much as some of us, you know, we miss a piece of in person, but having the ability to have people join from all over and be a part of these programs has been a wonderful part to come out of the pandemic. So thank you for being with us today and sharing. Are there any other thoughts or yes,
Yeah.
Rosalie? Yep.
Yeah, I usually don't like to read fiction about the Holocaust because I find most times it, you know, doesn't seem accurate. But I've read all of her books. I read one and then got turned on to her, and I find her books are really, really so close to the moment that I think it's really worth it. I really think that, you know, she nails it. So I think that her books are really worth recommending. And I really thank you so much for having her. I really enjoyed this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all. And I agree, she definitely nails it. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll look for programs in the future. Please reach out to us. We do have exciting programming in the works for starting in September again, but we are around all summer, and please reach out to us and be in touch. Thank you so much on behalf of Greater Metro West and the Holocaust Council. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Helene and Stella. It was such a pleasure to have you come on and also hear your personal words of wisdom. We always love to hear from you. So thank you. And thank you, Sue, for making our introductions. Have a wonderful day, everyone.